Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that sounds dramatic on paper, but we're going to let it unfold very, very slowly. So dim the lights, maybe get comfortable, and let your brain do that nice drifting thing where history just sort of happens in the background. Because tonight, we're talking about how one of the most powerful empires in the Americas fell apart in about 2 years. Which, if you think about it, is not a lot of time. That's barely enough time to commit to a gym membership, let alone lose an entire civilization. And the strange part is, it didn't feel sudden to everyone involved. In fact, for some of the people at the top, it probably felt inevitable. Like watching a slow-moving storm and thinking, well, that doesn't look great. So, let's ease into it. At the center of everything, we have an emperor named Moctezuma II. And he is, in many ways, exactly what you'd expect from someone running a massive empire. He's powerful, deeply ceremonial, surrounded by layers of ritual, and just slightly disconnected from reality, which, historically, is kind of part of the job description. He ruled over a huge system of cities and territories, all tied together through tribute, alliances, and, occasionally, the gentle suggestion of military force. And by gentle suggestion, we mean very organized intimidation. But Moctezuma wasn't just a political figure. He was also a religious one. His role wasn't just to govern, it was to maintain cosmic balance. The universe, in his worldview, was fragile. The gods needed to be kept happy. And if they weren't, things could go very wrong. So already, we're dealing with a leader who is not just worried about taxes and infrastructure. He's also worried that the sun might stop rising if the rituals aren't done properly. No pressure. Now, here's where things start to get a little uneasy. In the years leading up to the empire's collapse, there were reports, later written down, of strange omens. Lights in the sky. Fires. Unusual weather. The kind of things that, if you're already living in a deeply symbolic worldview, don't feel random. They feel like messages. And Moctezuma, being who he was, paid attention to those messages. He didn't shrug them off. He didn't say, "Oh, that's probably nothing." He took them seriously. Because in his world, ignoring signs from the gods would be like ignoring a fire alarm and hoping the building just sorts itself out. So you have this emperor, already a bit tense, already managing a massive and sometimes unstable system, now quietly wondering if the universe itself is trying to tell him something. And then, of course, things escalate. Because eventually news arrives of strangers. Not just any strangers. Strangers who look different, dress differently, and arrive on ships that seem, to the people seeing them for the first time, almost unreal. Floating structures, moving across water, like something out of a dream. And this is where Moctezuma's situation becomes complicated. Because on one hand, he is an emperor. He has armies. He has authority. He has the ability to respond decisively. On the other hand, he is also a man who has been watching the sky for signs that something big is about to happen. So when something big actually does show up, he doesn't immediately go, "All right, let's deal with this." Instead, he hesitates. And that hesitation is going to matter. A lot. But before we get too far into that, let's gently zoom out for a second. Because the empire Moctezuma ruled wasn't exactly universally loved. It was impressive, yes. Organized, powerful, wealthy. But it was also built on a system where many surrounding regions were required to send tribute. Goods, resources, sometimes people. And not everyone was thrilled about that arrangement, which is a polite way of saying there were quite a few groups who were not huge fans of the central. They complied because that was the smart thing to do, but they weren't necessarily loyal, more like strategically cooperative. And that's important, because empires don't just rely on strength. They rely on people continuing to agree, more or less, that the system is worth maintaining. Once that agreement starts to wobble, things can get a little fragile. Now, back to Moctezuma. When he hears about these newcomers, he doesn't immediately mobilize everything he has. Instead, he sends gifts, gold, textiles, carefully chosen items that are meant to show power, but also maybe encourage the strangers to go somewhere else. It's a bit like saying, here's something nice, perhaps you'd enjoy it over there, far away from me, which, in theory, is not a terrible strategy. If the strangers had been casual visitors, that might have worked. But unfortunately, they were not casual visitors. They were very, very interested in staying, and in everything Moctezuma had just sent them. So the gifts don't discourage them. They do the opposite. They confirm that there is wealth here, that this place is worth the effort, which is not exactly the outcome Moctezuma was hoping for. At this point, he's in a difficult position. If he attacks, he risks provoking something he doesn't fully understand. If he waits, he risks losing control of the situation. So, he does what many leaders do when faced with uncertainty. He waits. He gathers more information. He tries to understand. And while he's doing that, the situation keeps moving. Because the newcomers aren't just wandering around. They're making alliances, talking to local groups, learning very quickly that not everyone in the region is thrilled with the current empire. And this is where things start to quietly unravel. Because what looks on the surface like a powerful, unified empire is actually a network of relationships. And those relationships can change. If enough people decide that a new arrangement might be better, or at least worth trying, the balance shifts. And that shift doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, subtle, easy to miss if you're focused on the bigger picture. Moctezuma, meanwhile, is still trying to interpret everything through the lens he understands. Signs, omens, patterns. And the more unusual things become, the harder it is to separate what is happening from what it might mean, which is honestly a very human problem. Because when things start to feel uncertain, we don't just look at facts. We look for meaning. We try to fit events into a story that makes sense. And sometimes that story makes us hesitate. So instead of a swift, decisive response, what we get is a slow drift toward a situation that becomes harder and harder to control. The newcomers move closer. Alliances shift. The sense of stability begins to thin out, almost imperceptibly. And Moctezuma stays in the center of it all, trying to hold everything together while also wondering if this is exactly the kind of moment the signs had been warning him about. Not ideal. Now, here's the slightly ironic part. From a distance, it might seem like the empire fell quickly because it was weak. But that's not really accurate. It was strong. It was organized. It had resources and structure. What it didn't have was time to adapt to a very unusual situation. Because this wasn't just a military challenge. It was a cultural one, a psychological one. A moment where different worldviews collided, and one side took a little longer to decide what was actually happening. And in that delay, things started to slip. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough. A missed opportunity here. A cautious decision there. A choice to wait instead of act. And slowly, the balance shifted. So as we let this part settle, you can almost picture it. A vast, impressive city. Calm on the surface. Ceremonies continuing. Life going on as usual. And somewhere in the background, a quiet sense that something isn't quite right. That things are changing. And that maybe, just maybe, the world isn't going to stay the way it was. Let's float over gently into what happens next, because this is where the situation goes from uncertain to very, very difficult to reverse. So let's just gently continue from where we left off. You've got Moctezuma sitting in a city that still looks stable, still feels powerful. Ceremonies are happening. People are moving through markets. Daily life is carrying on in that calm, almost reassuring rhythm. And then, slowly, the strangers get closer. Not in a chaotic rush. Not like a sudden invasion wave. More like a very determined visit that no one quite knows how to refuse. At the center of this very awkward approach is Hernán Cortés. And Cortés is, how do we put this gently, extremely confident. The kind of confident that suggests he has already decided how things are going to end, even if no one else has been informed yet. He's not arriving alone, of course. He has a relatively small group with him, at least compared to the size of the empire he's walking into, which makes the whole situation feel even stranger. Because logically, this shouldn't work. A massive empire, a powerful ruler, thousands upon thousands of people. And then a few hundred outsiders showing up and saying, in essence, "Hi, we're here now." It's not exactly overwhelming force. But what Cortés does have is momentum. And more importantly, he understands very quickly that this is not just about direct confrontation. It's about relationships. So as he moves inland, he begins forming alliances. And these alliances are not hard to find, because, as we mentioned earlier, quite a few groups under the empire's influence were, let's say, not deeply emotionally attached to the arrangement. They paid tribute. They followed the rules. But if given another option, they were at least willing to listen. And Cortés offers them that option. Not necessarily in a clear, well-structured way. It's not like he shows up with a detailed policy document. It's more like, hey, we're not them. Maybe that's already an improvement, which for some groups is honestly enough. So now, instead of a small group of outsiders, we have a growing network of local allies. People who know the land, who understand the politics, who have their own reasons for wanting the current system to maybe not exist anymore. And suddenly, the situation starts to look less absurd. Still risky, still unlikely, but not impossible. Meanwhile, back in the capital, Moctezuma is still trying to manage this very delicate balance. He knows the newcomers are getting closer. He knows they're building connections. And yet, he still doesn't respond with full force. Part of this is caution. Part of it is uncertainty. And part of it might just be the sheer weight of the moment. Because if you commit to a response like that, if you decide to attack, to escalate, you can't really take it back. So instead, he chooses something that feels safer in the moment. He invites them in. Yes, really. He essentially decides, let's bring them into the city. Let's observe them, understand them, keep them close. Which, to be fair, could have worked under different circumstances. If your guests are normal guests, this is a perfectly reasonable strategy. But these are not normal guests. These are guests who arrive, look around, and quietly think, this is extremely valuable. So Cortés and his group enter the capital. And the city itself, Tenochtitlan, is stunning. Built on water, connected by causeways, filled with movement and color and structure. It's not some fragile settlement. It's a major, sophisticated urban center. And for a brief moment, everything is calm. There are meetings, exchanges, observations. It almost feels like a very tense but polite diplomatic visit. Moctezuma hosts. Cortés observes. Both sides are trying to read each other. And underneath that politeness, there's a growing tension that no one is fully addressing. Because each side is interpreting the situation differently. Moctezuma may still be trying to understand who these people are, what they represent, and how they fit into his worldview. Cortés, on the other hand, is already thinking several steps ahead. And this is where things take a turn that feels almost surreal. At some point, Cortés decides that the best way to maintain control is to take Moctezuma himself under control. Not in a dramatic, explosive way. Not with a loud declaration. More like a very firm suggestion that the emperor should stay under close supervision. Which is, again, one of those moments where you kind of pause and think, wait, this is actually happening? Because the most powerful figure in the empire is now, effectively, being managed by a small group of outsiders inside his own city. And somehow it holds, at least for a while. Moctezuma remains in place. He continues to perform his role, at least outwardly. But the dynamic has shifted. He's no longer fully in control. And people around him can feel that. And this is where things begin to quietly unravel from the inside. Because power is not just about structure. It's about perception. If people believe the emperor is in control, the system holds. If they start to suspect that he isn't, things get unstable. And that instability doesn't explode immediately. It spreads slowly, like a subtle change in the air. At the same time, Cortés is trying to maintain his position in a city that is very much not his. So the tension builds, quietly, gradually, almost politely, until something breaks. Now, depending on how the story is told, this breaking point can look slightly different. But the general shape is the same. There's an incident, a moment of violence, a loss of trust, and suddenly, the calm surface disappears. The city reacts, and Cortés, who had been carefully balancing this delicate situation, finds himself in a much more dangerous position. Because now, instead of a controlled environment, he's dealing with open hostility. And this is where things get very difficult. For everyone, the alliances that seemed helpful now become complicated. The city that was welcoming is now defensive. The emperor who was being managed is now in an impossible position. And the whole situation, which had been slowly tightening, finally starts to move. Not smoothly, not predictably, just forward. Moctezuma, caught in the middle of all this, tries to calm things down. He addresses his people, attempts to restore some sense of order. But by this point, the balance has shifted too far. The perception of control is gone. And once that perception disappears, it's incredibly hard to bring it back. So the system that once held everything together, alliances, authority, ritual, begins to loosen. Not because it was weak, but because it was never designed to handle something quite like this. And as everything starts to slide out of alignment, you can almost feel that earlier hesitation coming back into focus. All those moments of waiting, of observing, of trying to understand before acting. They made sense at the time, but now they've added up. And the situation is no longer something that can be carefully managed. It's something that has to be survived. So as we let this part drift to a close, the city is no longer calm. The guests are no longer just guests. And the emperor is no longer fully an emperor in the way he once was. Everything is still there. The buildings, the people, the structure. But the stability that held it all together has started to dissolve. And once that process begins, it tends to continue. Slowly. Relentlessly. Let's gently move forward into what happens when everything finally starts to come apart, piece by piece. All right, let's settle back in. By now, the city is no longer pretending that everything is fine. That quiet, polite tension we had earlier has drifted away. And in its place, there's something heavier, less stable. Like a room where everyone suddenly realizes the situation is not under control, but no one quite knows what to do next. Moctezuma is still there, still present, still technically the emperor, but technically is doing a lot of work now. Because authority, as it turns out, is a delicate thing. It doesn't just exist because someone says it does. It exists because people believe it does. And once that belief starts to crack, everything becomes a little uncertain. So when Moctezuma tries to calm the unrest, tries to speak, to reassure, to restore order, it doesn't land the way it used to. Not because he suddenly forgot how to lead, but because the situation has changed around him. People are watching him differently now, listening differently, wondering quietly if he's still the person who can fix this. And that hesitation spreads. Meanwhile, Cortés and his group are not exactly comfortable. They're still inside a massive city that is increasingly unhappy with their presence. Their position, which once felt bold and strategic, is starting to feel a bit fragile. And this is where the balance finally tips. There's a confrontation, not a slow, cautious one, a real one, the kind that makes it clear that whatever understanding existed before is gone. And after that, there's no easy way back. So Cortés and his people decide to leave the city, not as honored guests, not even as controlled occupants, just leave, which, as you might imagine, is not a simple process, because the city is built on water, connected by causeways, narrow paths leading in and out, beautiful, efficient, and not particularly designed for a quiet exit under pressure. So what we get is a retreat, a tense, difficult movement out of a place that no longer wants you there. And this is often remembered as one of those moments where everything feels like it's happening at once. Movement, confusion, fear, urgency. But if we slow it down just a little, it's also a series of small human moments. People trying to carry what they can, trying to stay together, trying to make sense of a situation that has moved far beyond careful planning. And in the middle of all that, things go wrong. The retreat becomes chaotic. The path out becomes dangerous. And what was meant to be an escape turns into something much more difficult. Losses happen, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, just steadily, quietly, one moment at a time. And by the time it's over, Cortés and what remains of his group are no longer inside the city. They're outside. Alive, yes, but changed. Because whatever control they thought they had is gone. And whatever stability the city once had is also gone. So now, both sides are dealing with the aftermath. On one side, a city that has pushed out an unwanted presence, but at a cost. A sense that something irreversible has happened. On the other side, a group that has survived a very difficult moment, but is not ready to give up. Which brings us to a slightly uncomfortable realization. Because if this were the end of the story, it might feel like a kind of resolution. The city resisted. The outsiders left. Balance, in some form, restored. But that's not what happens. Instead, everything continues. Cortés regroups, rebuilds his alliances, strengthens his position. Because remember, he's not alone. He has support from groups who still see this as an opportunity to change the system they've been living under. And those alliances don't disappear just because one attempt failed. If anything, they become more focused, more determined. And this is where the situation becomes less about a single event and more about momentum. Because now, instead of a cautious approach, we have something more direct, more deliberate. The earlier hesitation is gone, on both sides. And Moctezuma is no longer part of this next phase. His story, which began at the center of everything, fades here. Not with a dramatic ending, but with a kind of quiet removal from the narrative. And that, in its own way, feels fitting. Because this entire situation has been less about sudden, explosive moments and more about gradual shifts. Small changes that build into something larger. So now, the empire moves forward without him. And the question becomes, can it hold? Because the structure is still there. The people are still there. The city is still there. But the conditions have changed. The sense of certainty is gone. The idea that things will continue as they always have is gone. And in its place, there's something else. Something more fragile. So as we let this part settle, you can imagine the quiet that follows a storm. Not complete silence. Just a different kind of noise. Rebuilding. Preparing. Waiting. Because everyone knows now that this isn't over. It's just paused. And when it resumes, it won't be the same careful, uncertain process we saw at the beginning. It will be something more final. So let's slowly drift into that final phase where the outcome, once avoidable, starts to feel inevitable. All right, let's ease back into it. At this point, everything feels quieter. Not calm, exactly. Just quieter in that way things get after something intense has already happened, and everyone is left standing there thinking, okay, so what now? The city is still there. The structures, the canals, the movement of daily life trying very politely to resume. People still go to markets, still cook, still talk. Because life has a habit of continuing, even when everything underneath it has shifted. But the stability that once held it all together is thinner now. Not gone, just stretched. And outside the city, things are not slowing down at all. Cortés has had time to recover, which for him is less about resting and more about reorganizing. Rebuilding alliances, strengthening connections with groups who are still very interested in seeing the old system gently disappear. And this is where the situation becomes less about one dramatic clash and more about something quieter. A tightening, because instead of rushing back in, he prepares. He gathers support, not just a few groups, but many. Each with their own reasons, their own frustrations, their own quiet willingness to try something different. And slowly, what was once a small, uncertain force becomes something more substantial. Not overwhelming, but enough. Enough to try again. Meanwhile, inside the city, leadership has shifted. After Moctezuma, new figures step into power, trying to stabilize things, trying to restore that sense of authority that has been slightly shaken. And to be fair, they're not incompetent. They understand the situation. They know the threat is real. And they're not approaching it with the same hesitation we saw earlier, which in another timeline might have made a difference. But now, the timing is different, because while the city is trying to recover, the forces outside it are becoming more coordinated. And then, eventually, the next phase begins. Not with a sudden explosion, just a return. Cortés and his allies move toward the city again. But this time, it's not a cautious visit. Not a diplomatic approach. It's more direct, more focused. And the city, now fully aware of what's at stake, prepares to defend itself. So what we have is not a single battle, but a process. A gradual pressure. The city is surrounded, cut off in ways that are not immediately obvious, but become more noticeable over time. Supplies become harder to manage. Movement becomes more restricted. The sense of being connected to the outside world starts to fade. And this is where things become difficult. Not in a dramatic, fast-paced way, but in a slow, steady one. Because the city is built on water, yes, but it also relies on connections. On the ability to bring in resources, to maintain flow, to keep everything moving. And as those connections are disrupted, the system starts to strain. People adapt, of course. They always do. They find ways to cope, to stretch resources, to continue. But adaptation has limits. And as time goes on, those limits become more visible. Now, here's the part that feels almost quietly ironic. Because for all its strength, for all its organization, the empire is now facing a situation it wasn't really designed for. Not a single decisive battle, but a prolonged disruption, a steady wearing down. And that's harder to respond to, because there's no single moment to focus on. No clear turning point, just a gradual decline in stability. And inside the city, that decline is felt in small ways. Food becoming less reliable, movement becoming more cautious, conversations becoming quieter, not panicked, just aware. Aware that things are not improving. Aware that time is not necessarily on their side. Meanwhile, outside, the pressure continues. Step by step. Not rushed. Not chaotic. Just consistent. And over time, consistency matters. Because even a strong system, if it's under constant strain, begins to change. Not all at once. Just enough. So as days turn into weeks, and weeks begin to blur together, the situation becomes less about resistance and more about endurance. How long can this continue? How much can be maintained? And those are difficult questions because they don't have clear answers, only gradual ones. Now, let's gently pause for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Because from a distance, it might seem like this was inevitable. That once things started to go wrong, the outcome was set. But that's not entirely true. There were moments, many of them, where different choices might have led to different paths. Earlier responses, stronger alliances, faster adaptation, all possible. But history doesn't move through perfect decisions. It moves through real ones, messy ones, made by people trying to understand situations that don't come with clear instructions. And in this case, those decisions added up to a very particular outcome. So now, as we settle into this final stretch, the city is still holding, still resisting, still there. But the space around it is tightening. The resources are thinning. And the sense of inevitability, that quiet feeling that something is coming to an end, is becoming harder to ignore. All right, let's settle in one last time. By now, the city is still standing, but it's doing that thing where something looks intact from a distance, yet feels very different up close. The structures are there. The waterways still reflect the sky. People still move through familiar paths. But the rhythm is off. Not dramatically. Just enough that you notice it if you stay still for a moment. Because this is the phase where endurance starts to quietly run out. Not all at once. Not with a single moment where everything collapses. Just gradually. Like a long exhale that doesn't quite refill. The pressure from outside continues. Not rushed. Not chaotic. Just steady. And steady pressure, over time, has a way of changing even very strong systems. Inside the city, people are still adapting, still trying, still making do with what they have. But the margin for adaptation is getting smaller. Food becomes more uncertain, movement more restricted. The sense of connection to everything beyond the city becomes faint. And when that connection fades, something else begins to take its place. Not panic, just a quiet understanding that this might not turn around. Now, leadership within the city is still present, still trying to hold things together. Decisions are still being made. Efforts are still being organized. But the kind of control that once defined the empire isn't fully there anymore. And that's not because anyone suddenly stopped caring. It's because the situation has moved beyond what control alone can fix. Because at this stage, It's not about one decision or one strategy. It's about accumulation. Everything that has happened, the hesitation at the beginning, the shifting alliances, the loss of stability, the steady pressure, has added up to this moment. And this moment is heavy. So the final phase doesn't arrive like a dramatic ending. It arrives quietly, piece by piece. A section of the city becomes harder to maintain. Another becomes less active. Movement slows. Spaces that were once full begin to feel emptier. And eventually, the resistance that has been holding everything together begins to thin. Not because people give up, but because there's only so long you can hold something under constant strain. And when that strain finally becomes too much, things change. The city, which once felt like the center of everything, begins to shift into something else. Not gone, not erased, just transformed. And the people within it, those who have lived through all of this, adjust in the only way people can. They continue. Because even at the end of something as large as an empire, life doesn't stop. It changes. It reshapes itself around new conditions. Now, here's where we step back for a moment. Because the fall of this empire is often described as something quick. 2 years. A rapid collapse. A sudden end. But when you look at it like this, it doesn't feel sudden at all. It feels like a process. A long series of small shifts. Moments of hesitation. Moments of decision. Moments where things could have gone differently but didn't. And over time, those moments formed a path. A path that led here. To a city that slowly, quietly, could no longer hold the system it once did. And that's the part that feels almost understated. Because there's no single moment you can point to and say, that's when it ended. It's more like a gradual fading of one structure and the beginning of another. Not better, not worse, just different. And if we go back to where we started, Moctezuma watching the signs, trying to understand what they meant, it almost feels like the story comes full circle. Because in a way, he wasn't entirely wrong. Something big was coming. Something that would change everything. It just didn't arrive all at once. It arrived slowly, through people, through choices, through time. And by the time it was fully visible, it was already happening. So, as we let this story come to rest, there's no need for a dramatic ending. No loud conclusion. Just the quiet understanding that even the most powerful systems are, in the end, made of small, human pieces. And those pieces shift. They adapt. They change. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes faster than expected. But always in ways that, when you look back, feel both surprising and strangely inevitable. So tonight, as you drift off, you can let this one settle. An empire that didn't fall in a single moment. A story that didn't rush. Just a long, quiet unraveling. And that's where we'll leave it. All right, we can drift just a little further. Because even though the empire has, more or less, reached its end, the story doesn't actually stop there. It just becomes quieter, less about collapse, and more about what comes after. And what comes after is not dramatic. It's not a clean reset. There's no moment where everything pauses and then restarts in a neat, organized way. It's more like waking up after a very long, confusing night and realizing the world is still there, but slightly rearranged. The city, once the center of a vast system, is no longer functioning in the same way. The structures remain, at least in part. The layout, the memory of what everything was supposed to be.
But the role it plays has changed.
And the people within it adjust. Because they have to. Daily life doesn't disappear. It reshapes itself. Markets return, but differently. Conversations continue, but with new context. Familiar routines are rebuilt, piece by piece, around a reality that no longer matches the old one. And this is where history becomes very human. Because for the individuals living through this, it's not the fall of an empire. It's just life continuing under new circumstances. A different authority, a different structure, a different set of expectations. And that shift, while massive in hindsight, probably felt gradual in the moment. A series of small changes. New rules here, new faces there. Things that, one by one, begin to form a new normal. Now, if we gently zoom out again, we can see how all the pieces we've talked about come together. The hesitation at the beginning, the arrival of outsiders who didn't quite fit into the existing worldview, the alliances that quietly reshaped the balance of power, the loss of central authority, the steady pressure that wore everything down. None of these things on their own would necessarily end an empire. But together, they create a situation where the old system can't quite hold. And once it starts to slip, it doesn't need a dramatic push to fall. It just continues slipping. Now, here's a slightly dry, almost ironic thought to sit with. For all the stories about great battles and heroic moments, the actual ending of this empire is kind of administrative. Not in a boring way, exactly. Just in a way that reminds you that large systems often end not with a single event, but with a transition. Power moves. Structures shift. New systems are layered over old ones. And eventually, what once felt permanent becomes something remembered, which is honestly a little humbling, because the empire we've been talking about wasn't small. It wasn't fragile. It wasn't unimportant.
It was complex,
Organized, deeply connected to the people who lived within it.
and still it changed.
Not because it was destined to fail, but because it encountered a situation that required a kind of adaptation it didn't quite have time to complete. And that's the part that lingers. Not the speed of the fall, but the way it unfolded.
Slowly,
Quietly, through choices and circumstances that, in the moment, probably didn't feel like the end of anything. Just decisions. Just responses. Just trying to handle what was in front of them. So, as we ease into the final stretch of this story, there's no need to rush. No need to look for a dramatic closing moment. Because the ending has already happened. And what we're left with is something softer. A sense of transition. A reminder that history isn't just about what ends, but about what continues. And what continues is always shaped by what came before. So the people move forward. The city, in whatever form it takes, continues to exist. And the memory of what was, of how things used to be, becomes part of the story that gets passed down. Not as a single, clear lesson, but as a collection of moments. some careful, some hesitant, some decisive, all of them human. And as you let that settle, you can almost feel the pace of it slow down, from the urgency of earlier events to something much calmer, much quieter. An empire that once defined a world, now just part of it. And that's where the story gently fades out. No sudden ending, just a gradual return to stillness. All right, we can drift just a little further still. Because even after everything settles, after the structures shift, after new systems take their place, after daily life finds its new rhythm, there's one thing that doesn't quite disappear. Memory. And memory is interesting like that. It doesn't move in straight lines. It doesn't follow official timelines. It lingers. It softens some things, sharpens others, and occasionally it holds on to details that feel oddly specific. So even as the world changes around them, people remember. They remember what the city used to feel like when it was at the center of everything. When the markets were fuller, the movement more certain, the sense of order more confident. They remember the emperor, how distant he seemed, how powerful, how surrounded by ritual. And then, quietly, how that image began to shift. Not overnight, just enough. And that contrast stays with people. Because it's one thing to be told that power can change. It's another to watch it happen slowly, right in front of you. Now, here's where the story becomes a little more reflective. Because when we talk about why this empire fell in just 2 years, it's tempting to look for a single explanation, a simple cause, something neat and satisfying like, yes, it was this one thing. But as we've very calmly wandered through all of this, it's not just one thing. It's a collection, a series of moments that, on their own, don't feel final, but together create an ending. And memory tends to piece those moments together in its own way, sometimes emphasizing the dramatic parts, the arrival of strangers, the shifting alliances, the slow tightening around the city. Other times focusing on smaller details, the hesitation, the uncertainty, the feeling that something wasn't quite right long before it became obvious. And both versions exist side by side, which is honestly very human, because we don't just remember events. We remember how they felt. Now, as time moves forward, these memories begin to turn into stories. Stories told quietly, passed down, adjusted, reshaped, interpreted through different perspectives. And in those stories, the empire doesn't just end. It continues, not as a system of power, but as something remembered, something that still has meaning. And this is where the slightly ironic part comes in. Because even though the empire itself changed, faded, shifted, became something else, the idea of it didn't vanish. It stayed. In stories, in identity, in the way people understood where they came from. So, in a way, it didn't disappear at all. It just moved. From something you live inside to something you carry with you. Now let's gently connect this back to where we began. Moctezuma, watching the signs, trying to interpret a world that felt like it was shifting in ways he couldn't fully control. At the time, that probably felt like uncertainty, like confusion, like standing at the edge of something without quite knowing what it was. And looking back, it's easy to say, that was the beginning of the end. But in the moment, it was just another day where things felt slightly off. And that's the part that makes this story feel so quietly real. Because big changes don't always announce themselves. They don't always arrive with clarity. Sometimes they show up as small uncertainties, as decisions that feel reasonable at the time, as moments of waiting, observing, trying to understand. And only later do they take on larger meaning. So when we say the empire fell in 2 years, we're really talking about the final stretch of a much longer process. A process built on relationships, beliefs, structures, and choices, all slowly shifting, all leading eventually to a point where the old system could no longer hold. And once it reached that point, the rest followed. Not instantly, not dramatically, just steadily. So, as we let this final part settle, there's no need to draw a sharp conclusion. No need to wrap everything up with a single lesson. Because this story isn't really about a clean ending. It's about change. About how even the most established systems can shift when enough small things begin to move at once. And about how even after those systems change, the memory of them continues. Quietly,
softly,
in the background. So tonight, as everything slows down, you can let that thought drift with you. An empire that didn't vanish in a single moment. A story that didn't rush to its ending. Just a long series of small shifts, gently adding up to something larger. And even now, in the quiet after it all, still echoing. All right, just a little further. By now, everything has softened into that calm, reflective space where the urgency is gone, and what's left is just the pattern of it all. Because when you step back from the names, the places, the specific moments, what you start to notice is something almost familiar. Not in a dramatic way. More like that quiet realization of, oh, this kind of thing happens. Different times, different places,
different people,
but similar patterns. A powerful system, built over time, feeling stable, even permanent. A leader at the center, trying to manage both the visible world and the invisible meanings behind it. Because of course he was, why deal with just politics when you can also worry about the balance of the universe? And then, slowly, something new appears. Not necessarily stronger, just different. Different enough to be hard to understand at first. And that's where things begin to shift. Because when something doesn't fit into the way you understand the world, it's harder to respond to it quickly. You pause. You observe. You try to interpret. And sometimes that pause matters more than anything else. Now, this isn't to say that everything comes down to hesitation. That would be a bit too simple. There were alliances forming, pressures building, decisions being made on all sides. But that early uncertainty, that moment of what exactly are we dealing with here, creates space. And once that space exists, other things start to move into it. Alliances shift. Perceptions change. Confidence wavers, just slightly. And again, none of these things feel final on their own. They're just adjustments. Small ones. Reasonable ones. But over time, they begin to add up. And this is where the story becomes less about any one person and more about the system itself. Because even a strong system relies on balance, on shared understanding, on the quiet agreement that everything is functioning the way it should. Once that agreement starts to loosen even a little, the system has to work harder to hold itself together. And if something continues to press against it steadily, consistently, it becomes more difficult to maintain that balance. Now, here's a slightly dry observation. Empires don't usually plan for completely unfamiliar situations. They're very good at handling known challenges. Internal conflicts, external threats, resource management. But something that doesn't fit into existing categories? That's harder. Because there's no script for it. No clear set of steps. Just interpretation. And interpretation takes time, which in this case was limited. So when people look back and say, how did it fall so quickly? The answer isn't really about speed. It's about timing. All of these factors, uncertainty, shifting alliances, gradual pressure, lined up in a way that compressed the final phase, made it feel fast, even though the underlying process had been building for much longer. And that's the part that feels almost quietly ironic. Because from the inside, it probably didn't feel fast at all. It likely felt like a series of long, complicated moments, each one requiring attention, each one unfolding in real time. Only later does it become 2 years. A neat, simplified version of something that, in reality, was anything but simple. So, as we drift toward the very end of the story, there's one last thing to sit with. Not a lesson, exactly. More like a pattern. The idea that stability isn't just about strength. It's about adaptability. About how quickly a system can recognize something new and adjust to it. And when that adjustment doesn't happen fast enough, or can't happen in the way it needs to, the system begins to shift. Not dramatically. Just enough. Until one day you look around and things are no longer the way they were. And that change, which once felt distant, has become real. So tonight, as everything settles into stillness, you can let that pattern fade gently into the background. No sharp edges. No sudden endings. Just the quiet understanding that even the largest systems move, change, and eventually become something else. And that's where we'll finally let this one rest.
Slowly,
Softly. Right where it belongs. Alright, just a little longer. By now, the story itself has already settled. The empire has shifted, the city has changed, and everything that once felt central has gently moved into the background. And yet we're still here talking about it, which is, in its own quiet way, a bit ironic. Because most of the people who lived through these events weren't thinking about history. They weren't framing their days as part of a larger narrative. They were just living, trying to make sense of things, trying to adapt, trying to continue. And that's where this final stretch of the story becomes less about what happened and more about how we understand it now. Because when we look back, we tend to smooth things out. We take a long, complicated process and turn it into something more manageable. Something we can explain in a sentence or two. The empire fell in 2 years. Which is technically true, but also a little misleading, because those 2 years weren't just 2 years. They were filled with decisions, pauses, misunderstandings, adjustments, small, quiet moments that didn't feel like the end of anything at the time. And yet, they were. Now, here's a gently amusing thought. If you could go back and stand in the middle of the city at the very beginning of this story, before the strangers arrived, before the uncertainty, before the slow unraveling, and you told someone, in about 2 years, everything is going to change, they would probably look at you like you'd had a very long day. Because from their perspective, things felt stable,
structured,
normal. And that's the thing about large systems. They don't feel fragile from the inside. They feel permanent. Until they don't. And even then, the shift doesn't announce itself all at once. It arrives quietly, through moments that seem manageable, through choices that feel reasonable, through situations that don't quite fit into existing expectations. And by the time the full picture becomes clear, it's already in motion. Now, as we drift even further from the events themselves, what we're left with is not just the story, but the tone of it. And the tone, interestingly enough, is not as dramatic as you might expect. It's not a story of sudden destruction. It's a story of gradual change, of a system encountering something new, trying to understand it, and slowly finding itself unable to adjust quickly enough. And that's a very different kind of story. Quieter, more reflective, a little less satisfying, maybe, if you're looking for clear turning points and decisive moments. But also more real, because real change rarely happens all at once. It accumulates. It builds. It shifts the ground beneath things just enough that, eventually, everything has to realign. And that's exactly what we've been watching this entire time. Not a collapse, but a realignment. A movement from one structure to another, from one way of understanding the world to a different one. Now, as we let this final part settle, there's no need to revisit every detail, no need to trace every step again, because the shape of it is already there, clear in its own quiet way. An empire that didn't fall in a single moment. A story that unfolded slowly through human choices and circumstances. And an ending that didn't arrive with a dramatic conclusion, but with a gradual shift into something new. So as everything fades out, you can let the last of it drift away. No urgency. No tension. Just the soft, steady feeling of a story coming to rest. And maybe somewhere in the background, the quiet recognition that this kind of pattern isn't unique, that it happens again and again. Different names, different places, same slow movement. And with that, we can finally let the story go. Not abruptly. Just gently. Alright, this is where we really let everything slow down. Not because there's more action left, there isn't, but because sometimes the end of a story isn't about what happens next. It's about how it settles. And this one settles very quietly. By now, the empire we've been following is no longer something active. It's no longer making decisions, managing systems, or holding together a network of relationships. It has already shifted into something else. Something remembered. Something interpreted. Something a little distant. And distance has a way of softening things. The tension we felt earlier, the uncertainty, the hesitation, the slow pressure, starts to blur at the edges. not disappear. Just become less sharp, easier to hold, easier to think about without feeling the weight of it. And that's where this final moment lives, in that space between what happened and how it's remembered. Because when we look back now, it's easy to trace the pattern, to see how the hesitation at the beginning created space, how the arrival of something unfamiliar disrupted the balance, how alliances shifted slowly but steadily, how pressure built over time, and how, eventually, the system couldn't quite hold. It all makes sense in hindsight, but of course it does. Hindsight is very good at that. It takes something complicated and gently arranges it into a shape that feels understandable, even inevitable, which is slightly unfair to the people who lived through it, because for them, it wasn't a pattern. It was just life unfolding, moment by moment, decision by decision, without the benefit of knowing where it was all leading. Now, here's one last quiet thought to drift with. The idea that the end of something large, something structured, something powerful, is rarely as loud as we imagine. It's not always a single event, not always a clear break. Sometimes it's just a gradual shift, a slow transition from one state to another. So slow that, in the moment, it barely feels like an ending at all. Just change. And that's exactly what we've been sitting with this entire time. Not the fall of an empire in the dramatic sense, but the gentle, steady process of it becoming something else. And once that process is complete, there's nothing left to push against. No more tension. No more uncertainty. Just stillness. So as we reach the very end of the story, there's no need for a final conclusion. No summary. No big takeaway. Just the quiet recognition that everything has already settled into place. The city, in whatever form it continues. The people adapting as they always do. The memory of what was, lingering softly in the background. And the story itself now at rest. So tonight, as you let your thoughts slow down, you can leave it here. An empire that didn't end in a single moment. A story that didn't rush. Just a long, calm unfolding that eventually came to a stop. And that's enough.
Good night.